2004 and a half. Week of Daniel. Amen. Now, I want to just give a little bit of background here for some things. From this point right here, as it's divided by the blue line, this represents the last week of Daniel, the 70th week, in the two different 3.5-year parts. This represents from the crucifixion of Christ through to the year, calendar time, 2004 and a half. This is taken from Hosea chapter 6, verses 2, wherein it is prophesied by the prophet Hosea. And that was prophesied way before the weeks of Daniel was ever given to Daniel. Now, after 2 days shall Israel be revived, which means 2,000 years of dispensational time, 1,000 years each. Now, we realize we're just a few years away from then the proximity of the week of Daniel. It is a 7-year period. So we can say then, with 3 years and a little fraction till we fulfill the year 2000, I saw in the Jerusalem Post yesterday, right now, they're asking different heads in the government, come up with a solution what to do about the computer. Because they've got computers running their military intelligence. They got computer running their whole economic structure. And you know, you read as much of it I have. They say by the year 2000, the computer can divert back to 1900. How will it print out the year 2000? In other words, they leave it like it's going to be a great big explosion. Well, I don't know nothing about a computer. I know how to stretch barbed wire fence, but that's about all. And sometimes I get myself cut up with that. But it lets you know man's technology has its benefit, but it only goes so far. The human mind was made by a creator who designed it and give it an intelligence. I don't care how much a computer can do. It took the human mind to make the miserable thing. And we have to say this, then there is a higher mind that's above the human mind. That ought to speak to scientists and let them know there's a God that sits above all of this. Now, as we're dealing further in this cup of trembling, in the Jerusalem Post, they spoke of a demonstration last week they had in the Gaza Strip. Behind the scenes, now they find out Yasser Arafat had given the demonstrators the green light to go ahead and demonstrate, while from the public and the news media, he is seeking to comply by all the Oslo terms as they tried to pressure Netanyahu to come and comply with his. I cannot help but believe, common sense tells you, there's a God that's watching this whole scene. And my point is, when the time has arrived that God says, now I want my city rebuilt, then God is going to suddenly tear up man's plans. That could be 3 weeks from now, it could be 3 months from now, it could be a year and a half from now. But we're cutting this time factor down. If this yardstick up here, this yard of measurement is accurate. And I have to say this. These terms of measurement would have never put in the Bible if there wasn't a reason behind it. What would be God's purpose in telling Daniel, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people? Then from verse 25, he starts in breaking it down into its different sequences. What's the objective? God was giving these children of Israel, those that would eventually leave and go back, a means by how to begin to gauge time and to look towards the appearing of their Messiah. Had they been looking at that in a right way, they should have been able, especially, we will say, the educated scribes, should have been able to say, gentlemen, we are in a decade, that we can expect our Messiah. Because look what Daniel said. But look what happened. There was nobody saying anything. Even then, when the Messiah does come on the scene, what happens? They're as blind as a bat. So we can say this morning, when we read Hosea, that 2 days is speaking of a time of national dispersion. They've done come through that. And at the end of them 2 days, we shall be revived. That takes you exactly to Revelation 11. Now then, I don't want to deal so much with that this morning, only to establish how short time could be. We can say this. When God starts the scenes in the Middle East to set all of these scriptures in order, in application, we don't have to believe we need 10 years, 15 years. God will wrap it up in a short order of time. Now then, we can say this then. The cup of trembling is a picture of nervous political tension between the Jew and the Arab. The burdensome stone is to show the diplomatic negotiating process by world leaders, which have naturally always had the last say in whatever Israel has been eventually wind up doing. But when that has run its course, now then, there can be nothing. But God's going to cause the Jew. I cannot help but believe, as long as we have a modern Jew with political ideas of trying to compromise with Western influence, God is going to let some of those Jews fall a victim to a trap of the Arab. And there's going to be some innocent Jews, enough of them to get massacred, that when it's over, every Jew will be crying. Every Jew will be doubling his fist. Every Jew will say, let's stop this nonsense. God has to change the heart of the leaders. And sometimes it takes a bitter pill for them to get their eyes open. Now then, what happens then? The thing the world don't want to face. This shaking of all things can be none other than there's going to be a military confrontation. No, it's not going to be a threat, but it's going to be a display of God using Israel. It's not necessarily the military men of Israel making the threat. It's God using it. Because we've got to go back in these scriptures now and see what brings this thing on. Now then, let me say this morning. We know what the Gulf War wound up like. I have to say, as far as America's involvement, it was a miracle war. I was in the Philippines. We had an estimated around 330,000 troops in the Philippines in World War II. But we lost a lot of men. And the firepower then was much smaller than it was in the Gulf War. The Gulf War could have wound up. We put at least 400,000 men in the Gulf, in a sandy, hot region. We could have wound up with 50 or 80,000 casualties. Because that man Hussein plainly said, when we begin to bring the troops in, you will wallow in your own blood, and pointed his finger, this bunch of infidels. My wife went to school with a man. And the very time that we was massing the troops in the Gulf, they had a reunion of her class. We went to that reunion. It was hot in that gymnasium, so I stepped outside the door to cool down a little bit, and here was this man. I asked him what his name was. He told me he worked for America's strategic rocket, whatever you want to call it. He had worked in that setup out there in Denver, in the mountains beyond Denver, and then he had worked down here at the place in Florida where they launched these big rockets. And here's what he said. He said, it looks like there will be a war in the Middle East. And he says, I can say this, it will be a war of wars. Because he says, we have equipment stored in Saudi Arabia we cannot afford to let the Iraqis get a hold of, nor the Russians. But he says, if this comes to a ground war, he says, we will use it. And the world will know it's a war. Now, some friends of ours in Canada had 2 TVs with 2 video recorders going. They left them turned on all the time. We was listening to CNN tonight when the aerial bombardment started. CNN, those men, was in a hotel, when all of a sudden they heard the ack-ack cut loose. CNN had their men in the strategic spots. I've got all these videos of all of the military aerial showings of the dive bombings and such. Israel never wanted to really give America any credit for too much. But I have to say this. It's because we would not let them enter in. Let's look at it in this light. If we would have let Israel enter in, then we would have had to fight the thing alone. By having this way, it made it a coalition, which I don't agree necessarily with what the final outcome was. They should follow that man right straight on home and tore Baghdad all to pieces. And then, absolutely, instead of doing them like they do, let the people starve to death over there, they should have went after the man that's brought all that condition on. But nevertheless, that's the way the West does things nowadays. I have to say, when Israel does it, they will do it right. Now, there was equipment that had never really been used in warfare. But when it was brought out, it worked precisely. I don't say 100% accurate, but most of it was right on time. I saw them how they demonstrated one of these infrared sights. They had this camera set up in a hotel window. Night has set in. They said, watch this building. They zeroed this camera on this building, which was down a street, across the street from a parking lot. There sat 3 cars. There was a car that had just drove up, and the motor was hot. Emanating from that motor was heat. You could see that in this infrared sight. With the natural, you couldn't see a thing, but looking through this, it made a whole picture of things. Suddenly, out of a doorway of a building, here come a human being. His body is emanating heat. You can see the whole profile of that person walking across the street to this particular car. It showed up white. Every step. What a target in the night to shoot at. When our bombers in the air, as they would bomb after night, they knew that within these Iraqi tanks, the motor had to be started ever so many hours to keep the batteries charged. This would mean that tank would be sitting there emanating heat. Them bombers would fly over with these type of sights. They could be at a certain altitude, wouldn't be able to see a camouflage bunker or anything. But here's these sights, picks out every place where there's a tank or some kind of armored equipment that the motor has just run. What a target. They just fire a rocket, and that's the end of that. This is what, brothers and sisters, helped to put fear in the Iraqi troops. When I watched one morning how that one of these helicopters, I forget what they called them, but it had all these rockets hanging under it like a spider. And there it spotted this bunker with 430-some Iraqi soldiers in there. They dropped just a little flare down there, or a bomb or whatever it was, with the little banner things, surrender or we blow you up. Here is this helicopter just sitting out there chugging the air. One lone helicopter. And all of a sudden, out of that bunker comes men crying with things on their fingers and sticks and such, surrendering, begging the Allied soldiers. And I saw one GI as this Iraqi was on his knees crying. And that that American soldier laid his hand on his head. Don't be afraid. I have to say, our politicians made us fight in Korea, their war, and we lost. We went to Vietnam to fight another politician's war, and we lost. Humiliated. And when our soldiers from Vietnam came home, here we have a bunch of rebels here in this country that met them at the airports or the ship docks, spitting at them, blaspheming them, calling them by name. When Schwarzkopf and those men designed the Gulf War, Schwarzkopf said, I'll take command if you give me a free hand. Down the streets from the White House was a bunch of demonstrators. No blood for oil, no blood for oil, beating their drums. But the minute our aerial assault started, and the report began to come in of what these bombers was done, the drums stopped. Because their idea was, we're going to get thousands of men butchered because, Madman Hussein said, you will wallow in your own blood. Right here in eastern Kentucky, a young boy that was in the reserves, his outfit was called into duty. After he is in the Gulf, he wrote a letter home to his father. And he said, Dad, when we was put on the plane sat for 30 minutes on the runway waiting for a Gideon man to come and pass out each one of us New Testament. Saudi Arabia would not allow any shipments of our religious material, but they would not confiscate if the soldiers had it on their person. After they arrived in the Gulf War area, he said, "Dad, what time we wasn't training for the actual hour, we was praying and reading our New Testament." He said, "We knew we would know within 24 hours when we were to make the assault." They had dug trenches, bulldozed trenches in front of us. The Iraqis was going to flood these with crude oil and then fire them. And they lay on the other side, fields of landmines. We feared, how will we cross these danger points? But he says the evening before the assault was to be made, he said the wind had been blowing against us all day. But during the night, the wind changed completely opposite. And it started raining when it hadn't rained for days. He said they came through and give us this shot, which is an antidote to the bacterial warfare if they, come in contact with any of that stuff. And we knew we was ready to make our move. Just at the breaking of dawn, he said the word came. He said when we moved out of our positions, out across that sand, we come to these trenches, no fire. On the front of these bulldozers was blades that looked like it was D-shaped. They could drop them down, say, 6 or 8 inches in the sand, and the purpose is to plow out every mine and leave a pathway. When we got to those trenches, there sat the landmines like pineapples. The rain had washed them all out. We seen where every one of them was at. And when that Gideon man read that letter, I couldn't help but cry. Amen. Dad, we knew that God was on our side. We've got a modern society today that's as atheistic as the devil. They don't think God still lives. But I'll have to say, in 100 hours, we brought a beast to a point. Had the UN not said, that's far enough, they would have followed him into Baghdad. When the Iraqi people and soldiers was leaving Kuwait, they absolutely, socially raped the entire city of Kuwait. They took their little cars, they took their refrigerators, they took their washers, they took their TVs, and here these Iraqis are heading for home with all of this stuff, along with their military stuff. But just outside the city of Kuwait, our Allied forces hit them with everything from the air and turned it into a massive graveyard. You've seen it. There they're strewn from there to the border. Then when they get on the other side, and we're not supposed to cross over, then they turn on some of their own their own civilian people, which was, we will say, not the regular Iraqis. Kurds. And I'll never forget one morning how our soldiers, here at this borderline, and here was a little boy. He was caught in the crossfire of these Iraqi soldiers and these Kurds. And this American soldier reached his hand through the wire and begged the little boy, come. And that little boy was crying. And he crawled. And that American soldier helped him under the wire. I said to myself, God give the American troops a chance to regain his respect. displayed before the eyes of the world. We lost only 100 and some odd men, and some of that was just during training exercises. Now we can say this. It's not going to be that way when God turns Israel loose. It's going to be a miracle war, but it's going to be a war with this intent. God wants the world to set up and take notice. You've had your hour, you've had your day, you boasted in your power, your achievement, your technology, and all your learning, but you forgot me. Now, this is a scene you're going to watch. And I have to say, somewheres the world is going to be made to watch something take place, because the Gulf War was brought right into everybody's living room. From the Orients to the Aleutians, to the tip of South America, they saw a war fought right in their living rooms. It's going to be worse this time. Now, keep in mind, Numbers 24, 3,400 years ago, Israel was coming through the wilderness. Balak had asked Balaam to come and curse this people. You know the story. Balaam did his best, but God would not let him curse Israel. After he has tried with no success, now then Balak's beginning to get impatient. And Balaam said, come here. I'm going to show you what these people are going to do to your people in the latter days. That was 1,400 years before the advent of Christ. We're approaching 2,000 years after the advent of Christ. This is the latter days. And there's no need of some of these religious doctors of divinity say, oh, that was fulfilled a long ago. That was not. Because that was not the latter years. This is the latter years. This is the latter times. This is the latter days. When you turn to Numbers 24, you can see exactly the area of the Edomites, the area of the Moabites. God knew beforehand what these people, who are, yes, racially kindreds to Abraham, would do to his people eventually in time after they would cross into the land. When you turn to the prophet Obadiah, only one chapter, he prophesied 800 and something other before the advent of Christ. He saw something other that the Edomites, that's the ancient people of Esau, they're in the extreme regions of the country of Jordan. Edomites, Moabites, and the Ammonites. That's what the capital of Jordan is named after today, Ammon. When we look at this, Obadiah said, as he's speaking in the present tense, pertaining to Edom, think of it, 800 and some years, which was 200 and some years before it was fulfilled. Thou stood on the other side. Thou should not have looked upon thy brother in the day of his calamity. You should not been as the others. But you said, tear it down, tear it down, tear it to the ground. Meaning, when the Babylonians did, they invaded Jerusalem 3 times. There was 3 invasions. Each time they would do certain damage and then take a host of prisoners. The last time is when they tore the temple, demolished the city, took the well back, leaving only the sick, the lame, we will say, the misfits. They didn't want them. When we turn to the 137th Psalm, Now just imagine, here is Jews been carried away to Babylon to become slaves, servants, laborers in the Babylonian fields of agriculture, or whatever the Babylonians choose to make out of them. Here has been the Babylonians' way of taunting them. Let's read. Put yourself in this place. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song. Come on, sing us a song. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Can't you just see how they were taunted? How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. Here's their prayer. Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, meaning tear it down, even to the foundation thereof. That's what the Jews was saying, because they couldn't forget what that bunch of Edomites had done. Now then, in our modern world, they would say, oh, but you should forget. God don't. God don't, and He won't. So if you want to watch a movie, don't be out gallivanting around doing something else when this thing ever starts. Amen. God's going to give you a movie, you won't want to go to bed even. Because God remembered this. And that's why the Edomites are going to pay severely. Sure, it's a new generation. But keep in mind, some of their seed is in the land of Israel today, taunting them. Back as much as 7, 8, 9 years ago, when there was a lot of pressure being put on Israel about the Palestinians, in Reader's Digest was an article written by a historian. He says, many people think today that these present-day Palestinians are the mere descendants of a bygone era of Arabs that were always there. He's taking you back to the 12th century. Life in the Middle East was very rugged. But because the land of Israel along the Mediterranean was close to the Europeans' sea routes, the lifestyle was more prominent on the Mediterranean coast. As you leave that and come inland, going towards the desert countries, back into the Bedouin country, life gets rugged, it's hard. Out of the Bedouin background come people seeking an easier way of life. They come from this direction, they come from this direction, but they all come from the desert countries. Eventually, over a period of years, this is what put Israel with the present-day Palestinians. But he says their ancestors came from the Bedouin background, from the regions of Jordan, even as far away as some of them from Egypt. But that's the background they came from, all because the Mediterranean coastline was close to the shipping routes of European trade between there and Syria and so forth. With this in mind, then we have to realize these Palestinians that are there today, outside of a few, are basically living on someone else's land. You will find this in Ezekiel. Preferably, I believe, along about the 36th chapter. Somewhere's in there. God said, I will bring you back into the land I give your fathers, and I will establish you according to your former estates, meaning the deed. They are the only race of people that's got a recorded deed. And in actuality, brothers and sisters, when God told Abraham, get thee out of thy country and out from thy kindred, and come on down into the land I will show you, when he was giving Abraham the choice, it was the confrontation between Abraham and his sheep herders and Lot. Finally, then, God seen the attitude of Abraham's heart. He was willing to take the rocky country. Abraham was led up a little higher and said, look. And he looked east as far as he could see. And it says, unto thee and thy seed will I give all this land, from the river Egypt to the great river Euphrates, and as far as the eye can see to the great sea which was behind it. That's a promise. That includes all of Jordan and reaches into the borders of Saudi Arabia. Now then, we know this. Only under the time when King David was king did Israel ever gain the major proximity of this. But it only lasted for a short period of time. I read in Kings how David chased the Assyrians from to the river Euphrates. He captured horses by the hundreds and the chariots, and the slaughter he made. They knew that there had been an Israelite that had waged war. Now then, turn with me then. My part in reading this, my main aim was, this is the war coming up. How long will it last? Just long enough that God has convinced the world, I'm in this thing. Now shut your mouth. How many times has Israel retaliated by bombing a bunch of guerrillas? And if it kills some innocent civilians, the Western news media, see, look what Israel has done. If they wanted peace, why did they do that? Brothers and sisters, the Arabs aren't natured like Western people. I was told this. Probably Brother England, you remember. The guide says, an Arab can hate you, but if you come to his tent hungry, he will feed you. And while you're under his roof, he will be your friend. But the minute you depart, watch your back, because he has a right to stick a knife in you. Western nations aren't like that. No, they're hypocrites. Now then, we can say this then. Western diplomacy wants everybody to be humanitarian. But when you really look at this Middle East situation, it's like somebody taking a beautiful little baby and putting it in a crib with a rattlesnake. Well, I don't see no reason why they can't. Yet to some people that are idiots, that's the way they would look at it. But they want to spend a fortune. But can you tell me why the baby died? It shouldn't have been that way. Yeah, there's that great big thing laying there waggling his tail. It didn't hurt him. But that's the way the Western world looks at things of diplomacy. And we can say this. As the hour approaches, whenever that is, I can say this. You will know when it's on. And it will not change its course. until, brothers and sisters, you have seen the hand of God strike that Middle East using the Israeli military capacity, and it's going to be a miracle war of such a degree that Western leaders are going to say, I've never saw anything like this. Turn with me to Isaiah, the 19th chapter. Now, as I bring this in, I want us all to realize this is one of the things that God will do this side of the week of Daniel, somewhere in here. It's this type of war, and the way it is executed, and the purpose of God behind it, is how God through that speaks to some people in every nation. Because it causes people to realize there's a God, after all. And I want to say this, it's not going to be limited to the Western Hemisphere. From the Orient to the Isles of the Sea, in our modern day of communication, they're going to know there's a God of this earth and this universe that's got a little group of people in the land of the Middle East called Israel. And God is not doing this behind closed doors. It's going to cause people who were Buddhists, Hindus, Shintos, Jains, Sikhs, and all the rest of them, to what for once in their life realize there's a God of the Middle East. Yes, we know in the last half of this week, from beginning here, in the 14th chapter of Revelation, there's going to be an everlasting gospel preached. That's the last good news that same element of people are ever going to get. But these two things, a miracle war, this side somewhere, along with that is what helps to prepare the heart and the spirit of a mortal element of people, especially a young generation. And it convinces them. Otherwise, to go into that era without any warning leaves them to become victims of ignorance and to be destroyed by the coming of Christ. In the 19th chapter, I want to begin here in the 16th verse. Speaking of Egypt, because actually, brothers and sisters, when you think of Numbers 24, the effect of this war, and Israel doing valiantly. Valiantly is the word that's related only to military action. It's not on the athletic field. It's military field. Israel shall do valiantly. It'll start with Egypt, because there is an objective of God behind it. Too long, brothers and sisters, since 600 and something, has Mohammedanism ruled the Middle East and dominated and stained the desert sands with the blood of people, as they've done their best to behead, destroy the whole traces of Christianity, and to even get rid of Judaism. They've hid behind the cloak. We believe that Abraham was. We believe that Jesus was a prophet. We believe this and that. But in order to put themselves in the forefront, Muhammad was the last prophet, and there will never be another one. They became a military, aggressive, religious force. That did not happen until after Christianity in the 6th century has begun to cool down and become apostate. This made it possible then for Islam, a new idea, a new revelation, stimulated with a lot of military type action. Now then, let's look at it in this way. If God was to leave the world in the present status quo, yes, there's a lot of misgivings as to how could the city then be built in the temple. You know the whole thing right now. Israel cannot go there and absolutely tear the Mosque of Omar down. They would have the whole world breathing down her throat. You can't do that. But when the time comes, and the way God wants it, then God is setting the agenda. And I have to say, brothers and sisters, when God strikes this Islamic religion, He's going to strike it so hard with such a deadly blow that the Arabs that are left, they're going to be so afraid of Jehovah, they're going to forget all about Allah. That's God's purpose. They brought it on. Now they're going to get to meet God, Elohim, head first. In that day, Egypt shall be like unto women. What's going to happen? Because God, through Israel, is going to do something. And it shall be afraid and fear because of the shaking. Listen. The shaking of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which He shaketh over this. Egypt, I begin with you. Mubarak, present ruler, ready to jump right in with Yasser Arafat to put his disapproval against Netanyahu and anything the Israelis do. Mubarak, your day is coming. You can boast of your military might, but I'm going to take your spirit away from you. And you know, when God somehow or other touches the heart of people and He makes them start shaking like women, this is God's way of beginning to get attention to Himself. And the land of Judah shall be a terror. That's a word that describes ferociousness. I tell you, most are afraid of a big dog. But you let a little bulldog come lunging at you, and when he gets a hold of you, he's got a pressure squeeze in his jaws. It crushes bones and all. The land of Judah shall be a terror unto Egypt. Now, as we read down through here, we read the end results. That's the purpose. And I have to say this, brothers and sisters. Doctors of divinity, these historians could laugh me to scorn. But the day will come. If God was to let me live long enough, I'll point my finger right back at you. Now, who's right? God is sick and tired of this thing of intellectualism, international diplomacy, all of this mediocre political agendas that never reach a decent, just conclusion. So when God uses Israel, He's going to start, and when He makes a sweep, when God is done with Israel, you can rest assured, Islamism is going to be put to sleep forever. And He will not be 3 months in doing it, because He's going to use the Israeli military capability with such a striking force, and it's going to bring about so much desolation, and much of it is going to be miraculously. Those Arabs, when it's over, are going to know it was not Allah who fought on our side. It is Elohim who fought on Israel's side. Therefore shall be afraid in himself, because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which He hath determined against it. In that day. Now, verse 18 shows you the end results. What happens in Egypt after this. In that day shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan. This is a carryover. By the time the millennium has started, Egyptians are going to want to speak Hebrew. It's not them reaching back and speaking some old ancient Canaanite tongue. No, because the language of Canaan land in that day is going to be Hebrew. And it goes to show, God is going to cause Egypt to turn to respect the Jew. And this is his only way he can get the result. Strike him with such a deadly stroke, it creates such a fear that when they get their eyes open, it's Jehovah. Let's watch the result. They will speak the language of Canaan and swear to the Lord of hosts. It's now Allah. Allah this. Fight on our side. Allah this. Allah that. But then it's going to be Elohim, the Lord of hosts. One shall be called the city of destruction. In that day shall there be an altar. The Egyptians will not only just stop and want to worship the Lord, they will want to prove it by actions on their own part. There shall be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. And this is not some ancient pyramid. Don't never think that. And it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior and a great one, and he shall deliver them. That's got to be the coming of Jesus Christ as the end of all of this thing. Now then, when you read on down through there, especially when you come into verses 23, here it tells about Assyria and Egypt. I don't know how many has taken the Jerusalem Post, but about 3 years ago, there was an article in the Jerusalem Post. When Israel gave up parts of the Sinai back to Egypt, they had already made a pre-study of the Sinai ore and mineral deposits. They give Egypt the maps, because even then there is a discussion that from Cairo to Jerusalem, they want to build a superhighway for the fast transit of tourist trade. They all want their part of tourist trade. And this is the only way they feel they can get their part of it. Because the international tourist trade is one of the main financial resources of the Middle East nation. Syria wants to get on it. So they too, they want to have a superhighway from Damascus through the Golden Heights to Jerusalem. Now, if their minds is doing that now, you read these last 3 verses. Already, there is laid out by Egyptians design. They want to lay a gas line, and they want to share in the electrical output of the potential that they feel that they can get set up by whatever means, by harnessing the Dead Sea, or we will say the Mediterranean, through a tunnel that will absolutely power generators as it makes its plunge down through a tunnel to the Dead Sea. All of these are in Israelis' technology. So my point is this. Yes, that's a potential as the world would face the millennium. Because when the world faces the millennium, Egypt will no longer be a nation of people that will be hostile to the Israeli cause. Let's turn back now to the 11th chapter of Isaiah. This tells us, the prophet, now keep in mind, Isaiah 11, Zephaniah chapter 2, gives us almost the same description. What Israel's going to do to the land of the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. I'm going to start in the 12th verse here. This is a promise, how that God in the last days will again restore Judah and bring back Ephraim. Now this is one of the names the 10 tribes in biblical times was known by. The 13th verse says, when that has all come about, the envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. You take that, I think, it's to the 10th chapter of Zechariah. It tells you there. God said he would bring Judah first. That was the beginning of the great immigration following World War II, as Israel was made a nation, which was followed then, and he will restore Joseph afterward. Now, verses 14 tells us, when the two elements of Israel are now in the land, it is then God will cause them as a unit. But they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west. Well, the 6-day war accomplished that. But this peace plan causes Israel to relinquish just certain areas. So they pull back out of certain areas of the Gaza. But they still hold air superiority and such. But the 6-day war, they did not cross the Jordan River. But that is just ahead. They shall spoil them of the east. Now that's pointing then across the river. They shall lay their hand upon Edom. Here's the first one. Here's Numbers 24 going into a setting. And Moab. Number 24 again. And the children of Ammon shall obey them. There is definitely an end coming to King Hussein's kingdom. Because in ancient times there never was a country of Jordan. What wasn't the land of the Edomites, the Moabites, and Ammonites? The rest was Israel. Because the tribe of Reuben over there, and there's another tribe and a half, Manasseh, is over there. Syria wants Israel to give up the Golan Heights, which is part of the old area of Gilead. But Israel knows they cannot give up because it's a strategic ground. It's a plateau region by how they can overlook the whole Jordan Valley. If they was given back over to the Syrians, then Syrians could move their military, mortars, artillery, and everything, and stand right there and just lob anything they wanted to on their settlements, their villages and towns and kibbutz. So Israel is forced to keep it. And the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian seed. Now, that points to a drought condition. We are all familiar, and I will go back as far as 12, 13, 14 years. There has been a general drought condition overshadowed the whole of North Africa. It has periodically, it's moved. It's like a dark shadow. One time it's over Kenya. Another time it's over Sudan, Ethiopia. It's moved down the east side of Africa, from into South African region. I remember when Brother Gobinder wrote and told how certain effects of it. All that cloud just seemed like it just drifts backwards and forwards. But as this prophecy comes into full setting, something's going to happen, because we all know the Nile flows north to the Mediterranean, but its headwaters is in the plateau regions of Ethiopia and eastern Sudan. There is where the plateau regions develop all the waters that eventually feed the Nile. Yes, they have built dams to hold back the flow, but I have to say, as we get closer to this hour of this thing, you watch. God controls nature. and the tongue of the Egyptian sea. With his mighty wind, yes, a drought, shall he shake his hand over the river, and shall smite it in the seven streams, that's the delta, and make men go over dry shod. Think of it. Down here in New Orleans, if you ever saw a picture of the delta, think of the Mississippi getting dry enough that at the delta, you could see these fingers of sand deposits running way out into the Gulf of Mexico. And it gets so shallow, you could actually walk from one side to the other. That lets you know, brothers and sisters, God's got a way of making the world sit up and take notice. All of that is none other than God's way of striking nations as he shakes them to the core and making them turn their stubborn, religious attitude back to know him. This is God's way then, straightening them up. Now people could, oh, but he could do that in the millennium. I want you to know, when God gets through shaking nations and this planet, and earthquakes hit this place, and the day of the Lord and his wrath has executed in the various places of the earth, that in itself, there ain't nobody going to come through that. Only what God has allocated to survive and be a carryover into his millennium reign. All right, it's done past 12, so we'll quit until tomorrow. But tomorrow, brothers and sisters, I want to show you something. This right here. This end terminates about the year 2004 and a half. Brother Stroman is going to read you a dream that a man had a few years ago. When you get it calculated out, we'll see what happens. We'll see how it looks then. Heavenly Father, I just pray today, Lord, we're living, Lord, this side of a major earth-shattering, shaking condition that God, only you, can set in motion. But we know, Lord, your word is true to the very letter. Help us, Lord, that our hearts, our attitudes, our motives can truly be directed at you. Take these words, use them, Lord, as you see fit. I thank you, Lord, for my brothers, my sisters. And, Lord, just help us all to live in these last days the kind of life that pleases thee. We ask this now in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. God bless you, everyone.